basis. But it's a highly simplistic reading of punk. I mean, much of punk was actually deeply influenced by reggae. The Clash would be an absolutely great example. And actually, the use of fascist icons was much more, I think, about anti-authoritarianism than and a sort of flirting with dangerous symbols than it was a possession of Nazi politics. Okay, so now what I'm going to try and do is suggest to you that basically Mrs. Thatcher is a punk, okay? And that she, no, I'm serious, I really am. And that she emerges out of the same rubble as the punk movement, okay? In many ways, the conservative rhetoric of decline of Britain being in seemingly terminal decline was very, very much like the punk claim that there was no future in England's dream. Okay? Similarly, Thatcher and her supporters were just as critical of the of all of the same things as the punk movement, of paternalism, of the paternalism of sort of technocratic and elite society, of permissiveness of the 60s. You know, that was just the worst possible thing. One of her big supporters, Norman Tebbit, called the 1960s, I have to quote this because I love it, the insufferable, smug, sanctimonious, naive, guilty, wet, pink orthodoxy of that sunset home of that third-rate decade, the 1960s. So clearly he was no lover of that decade. And of course, Thatcher and her supporters were hugely critical of the way in which welfare capitalism had eroded a sense of individual responsibility and had eroded the entrepreneurial energy of the British economy. And finally, Thatcherism wrapped itself up in a critique of multiculturalism. Okay? One of the very first things that Thatcher does is produce yet another Immigration Act in 1981, and certainly flirts, like Keith Joseph, with the rhetoric of Enoch Powell, of the absolute central importance of containing and reducing immigration. But whereas punk celebrated, or at least certain strands of punk, like the Sex Pistols, celebrated an anarchic solution to these sets of problems, what Thatcher did was promise an authoritarian answer to them. So this is a key thing. Thatcher is she's promising a return to the free market, but to do it, she has to adopt a very authoritarian personality. Okay, you have to literally, break bones to enable the free market to be, to enable the market to be made free. And she was a moral authoritarian, as we'll see next week. Yeah, and then the last point, I guess, the last parallel, I guess, that I want to make is that just as punk wanted to say, look, you can do it yourself in terms of your music and your clothes, and you had to get away from these great big corporate monopolies. That was the argument. That was the so-called rock and roll swindle. So Thatcher argued that basically you could only develop, you could only get choice, you could only take responsibility for your own life, make something out of your own life in a system in which the market was free and it was shaped by the rule of law. So a good deal of conservative rhetoric, as you can see in the manifesto, is about not just liberalizing the market, but returning to the rule of law. Okay? Trying to get a handle on the sense of of the protests of the labour movement, not so bothered with the protests and the violence of white racists, but the idea was that somehow they were going to be a good thing. So the whole sweep of this was for Thatcher to be able to say, look, this whole period of time in British history from 1945 to 1979, this whole period that represented the creation of a new social democratic settlement with a welfare state, was a dreadful idea, a dreadful wrong turn, a dreadful error. Okay, and that what she was going to do was return Britain to what she believed were its original free market principles and ideas. Okay, which is why she often talked about a return to Victorian values. It wasn't just the Victorian value of the family, although that's important. It was the Victorian values of individual responsibility, of thrift, of self-help, and all of that occurring within a liberalised market system. Any questions about Mrs. Thatcher as a punk? Can't believe you sitting there so quietly and obediently. Yes. Well, yes, I may be saying there's two sides of the story, but you maybe won't want to come on Tuesday. No, look, I guess what I'm saying is I think that Mrs. Thatcher did very little that was good, actually. But what I'm trying to show is that there's a reason why she emerges, and a reason why the ideas and the policies that she's associated with emerged in the 1970s. And I think that's very important. That's very important to be able to get. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, many people, not just in the Conservative Party in Britain today, but many people many people, as we'll see on Tuesday, not least of which was Tony Blair, believe that Mrs. Thatcher did some very, very important things. And if they were to say what they were, they would probably single out two things, which was the reform of the trade union movement. Now, they may have, found a different mechanism, or they might have drawn the line in a different place, but basically the attack upon the trade union movement, which was very difficult for the Labour Party because it was partly funded by the trade unions, and the abandonment of nationalised industry. I think that most people in the new Labour administrations in the 1990s would have said that both of those things were things that she did well. How balanced am I? Okay. So, my God, I know that when you're sitting eating your turkey, you're going to be thinking, if only I was in Wheeler 215 listening to yet another completely dense and overpacked lecture. So this conclusion is to spread you out for the rest of the week. This is going to make you replete even before you've had your turkey. Okay, so the central point, this is like a key part in the class, okay? Because really since the midterm, I've been talking about the development of this new social democratic system, okay? And I've been saying, at least for the last month, that the perpetual question that we've got to try and figure out is, why did this system become so vulnerable to critique? Why was it that it lasted for such a brief amount of time? And now I'm just going to rehearse basically the arguments that I've been advancing to you over the last month or so. One of them is that social democracy wasn't just enormously successful. In fact, it was so successful in terms of delivering full employment and improving standards of living that it fundamentally eroded the class basis of its original support, which is to say that the old structural experience of poverty had disappeared, and with it, arguably, the insecurity of the working class. Indeed, as we saw, class became much more of an aspirational thing than a structural thing, or at least was felt to be an aspirational thing and not a structural thing. The other key argument, another key argument I've been saying, is that the radical critics of social democracy were also right. That even though it did a lot of good things, it didn't do as many good things as it said it was going to do. It didn't actually ever fully provide the universal leveling up of the population. Remember, we talked about homelessness. We talked about the position of seniors. We talked about we could talk about the plight of Commonwealth immigrants, etc., etc. Okay, the key groups continue to be left out of the universal promises of social democracy, and also you could suggest that part of that was because financially the welfare state was always on the back foot. That since its foundation in the 1940s, there were never the resources needed to deliver the universal promises that it had made. Thirdly, I've been suggesting that a key element of it throughout was that it was a deeply paternalistic project. That is to say that it was a technocratic, not a demotic project. It didn't arguably get people centrally engaged and participating in the project of social democracy. It was something that was often handed down to people rather than getting people involved in the actual structures of the social democratic system. And that critique of technocratic paternalism we're going to see is a huge thing that Mrs. Thatcher takes up. A huge part of her criticism of the state is the role that middle-class professionals, so-called welfare professionals, teachers, doctors, university lecturers, even policemen, had in the system. Two final points. These were deep roots, those previous 3 points that I'm making, but I'm suggesting, or what I've done today is suggest to you that the key moment of crisis comes in the 1970s because of the process of global economic restructuring. What we would now call globalization, this restructuring of a liberalized global economy begins in the 1970s, well, arguably in the late 1960s. And the consequences of that was to basically make national governments increasingly powerless against, or felt to be powerless against the sway of financial markets. So one of the things that you see Britain struggling with most acutely in the 1970s is trying to deal with the plummeting value of the pound and what that meant for its balance of payments deficits and the movement of investments in the pound. And finally, what I'm suggesting to you is the last key element of the 70s, which was the vilification, the critique of the labour movement that the activism of the 1970s makes possible. Okay? Central part of the Conservative manifesto is controlling the trade union movement, trying to